In questo video parliamo delle risorse che ti consiglio. This video, let's talk about the resources that I recommend you. So first of all, everyone has different needs. So this is a long list including many different things. Do not need to do everything, but try all of them. All of them except one are free, and warning, I'm not making any money. These are not my businesses. I'm not an affiliate. This is just what I think genuinely can be very helpful for you to speak Italian better. The first thing that I always recommend to everybody is pen and paper. Get a notebook, a notepad of sorts, and try to write, take notes. When you learn a word that you didn't know, write it down. When there is something that you didn't understand and now you do, write it down. This is so helpful in my opinion to kind of cement what you're learning. So first of all, try to have that ready. You will then have the slide deck. You will find it attached to the course. It includes everything you see on screen, and basically after each single unit, or almost, you will find exercises that you can practice, and the solution is on the next page. Please do the exercises as we proceed, as we improve. You do not need to study as fast anymore, because the topics you do when you study a language, it doesn't make sense. As you progress, the topics are less and less useful. You learn what you really need, which is the present tense and the future tense at the very beginning. And then, sure, it's good to know the subjunctive trapassato, but if you do not have a lot of experience using the present indicative tense, you do not need the subjunctive trapassato. So do not rush through the course. It's going to be here. I'm not going to take it anywhere. Just try to do it slowly and try to do a lot of exercises. Find more. I try to put as many as I can, but try to find more if it's not enough, especially for the topics you know you have a hard time with. Another resource that I always recommend is the app Duolingo, which is entirely free, and it will allow you to learn a lot of vocabulary. This course is not focusing too much on vocabulary because it's beyond the point. I focus on grammar. And learn words. If you learn a few words every day, that would be a very good exercise. If you want to practice conjugations or to look up a specific word, a verb, there's a lot of different resources. I personally like Word Reference. I think it's more intuitive than other websites, but any of these websites will do. But just have something bookmarked because it can be useful to understand how to do some irregular verbs tense. Very importantly, read newspapers. Sadly, Italian newspapers have a lot of paywalls if you compare it to, for example, American outlets. They can be very annoying to read. So I have 5 suggestions. The first one is called Easy Italian News. This is not a mainstream media. It's a small project. Some people do. Just write about news in a very simplified Italian. It's entirely free. No paywalls as far as I can tell. It's good because they tell you news, but they avoid complicated forms. They kind of make it a little bit easier. Usually newspapers are not super easy to read. So that's a good first step. When you feel confident with that, you can try and move to the mainstream media. In Italy, we have 3 different big newspapers. La Repubblica, which is left-leaning, Il Giornale, which is right-leaning, Il Corriere della Sera, which is center-leaning. And then we have Il Sole 24 Ore, which is about business and economy news. So these are the 4 websites that I recommend you check out. They have a lot of paywalls, word of warning, but maybe see what's good for you. I don't recommend you pay for them. If you want free news, you will find them. But these newspapers are the most famous ones. I think that's where you should start. And then you can just easily look on Wikipedia, a list of Italian newspapers, and go check them out. One that I like is Il Mattino, which is from Naples, I believe. And it's a lot easier to read because less paywalls. Now, very important, try to speak Italian as much as you can. This is so important. I know it's hard. Like if you live in New York, okay, granted, you will find some Italian who wants to speak with you. But if you live in, I don't know, Brazil, odds are there's not going to be many Italians around. So try to speak Italian as much as you can. If you have a pen friend, write to them. And a lot of people ask, should I take classes online? Consider that. There is a lot of different websites. I personally have used as a teacher, as a tutor. I've used Preply and italki. You can find knowledgeable teachers for $10 or less per hour. That may or may not be a lot of money for you. I don't know, up to you. But if you can afford it, and if you have no other way to speak to Italians in your area, that's definitely a good place to start. Going back to free resources, as you get a little bit better, watch Italian YouTube. Now, reading in another language is easier than listening. In my opinion, that's a no contest. But when you get a little bit better, then definitely check out YouTube. We have a lot of different YouTubers in Italian, speak Italian, different parts of Italy, different topics. You like cinema, you like video games, you like whatever you like, you will find something for you. Definitely give it a go. Definitely find what some famous Italian YouTubers are and try to understand what they're saying. It's not going to be easy also because self-generated caption in Italian is pretty bad. So it's usually not going to be very helpful, but definitely check that out. And finally, Marco, do I need a grammar book? The idea of this course is to replace a grammar book, is to be a grammar book in videos. So I personally don't think you need one, but if you like to have a grammar book, I do not have a personal favorite yet. I have not found something I really like, and the problem is if you live in the US, if you live in France, if you live in India, if you live in Brazil, you're not going to have the same brands everywhere. So I'm not really sure that I know of a globally good book, but just go on Amazon or any other platform or in a bookshop and try to get one with good references. And if you need, if you want to buy a book, go get something in the B1/B2 area. Usually it's going to be 2 separate books. And check out the syllabus of this course to make sure that there is somewhat of an overlap. Because obviously, different people have different ideas of what B1 is or B2 is. So it's going to be similar, but some things that I include are not going to be included, and some things that they include are not going to be included here. But generally speaking, intermediate, B1 and B2, that's roughly what you should look at. Let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about pronomi relativi, relative pronouns. These are somewhat similar to English: that, which, whom, whose, all of that. And I would argue in Italian they're slightly easier than in English because we have 2 types, but the use is easier, I believe, than English. They're just less to remember. So let's look at them a little bit. Il pronome relativo più comune in italiano è che. Che is by far the most common, most used relative pronoun in Italian, and we use it to connect 2 sentences when both have the same subject. Now that sounds hard, but if we look at it in English, I think it's gonna make more sense. Say that you have 2 sentences, they're separate, right? The person speaks and the person is my sister. You could say that in 2 different sentences. The person speaks, the person is my sister. However, you could also say something like, in this case in English, the person who speaks is my sister, or the person that speaks is my sister. There is also which in English, which you use for objects, but in Italian, all of these are the same. Che. They're the same subject, so we don't need any preposition. We don't need to say, for example, to whom, for whom, by which. We'll see that in a second. There is no preposition. There is just that, who, which in English. So what we would say in Italian is la persona parla, la persona è mia sorella, la persona che parla è mia sorella. Che does not depend on whether it's a person, it's an object, it's an animal. It does not change depending on the gender or number. It's just always the same. Again, I would argue easier than in English, where you have to worry about that, who, which. And then we have the other type of relative pronouns, those where the 2 sentences that we are connecting have different subjects. And again, I know sometimes it's confusing to talk about subjects, objects, so let's make examples in English. Let's say that we want to say something like, I spoke to the doctor and the doctor is tall, right? So in the first case, I spoke to the doctor, I am the subject. In the second, the doctor is tall, the doctor is the subject. So the subject is different in the 2 sentences that we want to connect. So in English, we couldn't say the doctor that I spoke is tall, right? We would need something in there. So we could say something like, the doctor to whom I spoke is tall. And again, in English, we have to worry because this is one of the things where English looks a bit more like German. You have cases a little bit, you have whom, you have whose, you have who. In Italian, it's a bit easier, and we use either cui or quale. They are the exact same thing. So let's see an example first and then we discuss about both. Il dottore è alto. The doctor is tall. Ho parlato al dottore o con il dottore. I spoke to the doctor or with the doctor. Il dottore a cui ho parlato è alto. O il dottore al quale ho parlato è alto. So how do we use cui and quale? So if we're using cui, we do not need the article. Il dottore a cui ho parlato. If we use quale, we do need the article. So il dottore al quale. Therefore, if it's plural, it would still be i dottori a cui ho parlato, but it would become i dottori ai quali ho parlato. If it's feminine, plural, for example, le dottoresse a cui ho parlato, hasn't changed, le dottoresse alle quali ho parlato. So cui is a bit easier because we don't need to worry about gender and number. It's always the same. I recommend you start with cui. And quale sounds a bit more elegant. It's used commonly in everyday conversation, but let's say that there is never going to be a situation in which cui sounds weird or wrong. There could be situations in which quale sounds like a little bit too much. So start with cui, also know what quale means because it's the same, and again, you need to understand it. So again, let's see a couple more examples. Il giorno in cui sono arrivato, o il giorno nel quale sono arrivato. Nel is in plus il, as we've seen in the previous course. Or for example, le persone di cui o delle quali ti ho parlato. Again, try to look at this, make examples with English, and you will see how Italian in this specific topic is simpler. Vediamo ora l'imperativo negativo. Let's now see imperativo negativo, so the negative command. We've seen in a previous course how we give an order to someone to do something. This is the opposite. We're giving an order to someone not to do something. And first of all, let's see again quickly how we give a command, an affirmative, a positive command, and then we see how to give a negative command. Let's see the verb mangiare. If you want to say eat, we'll say mangia. And remember that with the imperativo, we usually skip the subject because adding the subject makes it even stronger. So kind of try to avoid that. So, tu mangia, you eat. Mangi, he or she. Mangiamo, we. Mangiate, voi. Mangino, loro. And let's quickly recap a couple of things about the imperative. So first of all, we see that the lui, lei, and the loro are subjunctives. We've mentioned that before. We didn't know what a subjunctive is. We don't know that yet, but we'll know very, very soon. I already recorded the class. So we borrow the subjunctive form, present subjunctive for lui, lei, and loro. We then see that the noi and the voi are normal present tenses, indicative. And then the tu, in this case it's slightly different because it would be tu mangi, the present. Here it's mangia. If we look, for example, at the verb of the second conjugation or the third conjugation, it would be exactly the same as the present tense. So leggi, corri. But in this case it's slightly different, so it's good to remember. And we also saw that we try to avoid using too much the imperative. This is a tense that we want to use when it's really either like a mother-son or mother-daughter situation. So there is a clear chain of command, a clear hierarchy. This wouldn't even be used within a corporate setting by your boss with you. Generally speaking, it can be used, but it shouldn't. And we try to rather use something like per favore, so per favore mangia. So if you use the imperative without screaming and just putting per favore in front of it, it's fine. Or change it to where it's not just a clear command. But just in English as well, you wouldn't say you eat, but rather say please eat. It's just common courtesy. And we have a few irregular verbs here as well, just to remind you, because they're funny. Essere sì, for example, be nice, sii gentile. No, nobody uses that anymore, basically. Very rare example of two consecutive vowels that are the same, two I's. Very rare in Italian. Abbi, have, very commonly used, for example, in abbi fede, have faith. Sappi, know. Di, for dire, which we kind of see for example, dimmi. Dimmi che ora è. Tell me what time it is. Very common. Vediamo ora l'imperativo negativo. When do we see imperativo negativo? Again, this is an order, and this is mostly used in, for example, when you see that you cannot do something in a public square. Don't eat on the staircase. Non mangiare or non mangiate. See in a second. So how do we do this? Generally speaking, we put non in front of the verb. Non is the negation of a verb. So when you want to negate a verb and say, not something, you say no. No just means no. Non we use before verbs. So non mangiare, not no mangiare. And then a few different things. So again, we don't have the I because you don't give orders to yourself usually. We could say something like, for example, tu non mangiare il panino. If I'm talking to you, telling you not to eat the sandwich, telling you non mangiare, infinitive form. Weird, but extremely important that you remember that. And then for all the other forms, we just use the normal positive imperative and we make it negative. So lui, lei non mangi, noi non mangiamo, voi non mangiate, loro non mangino. I feel like this is important because sometimes you want to tell someone not to do something. This can be, for example, in a dangerous situation when you want to tell someone, don't do this, just don't jump, non saltare. It's very, very dark, but you get the point. Or, don't cross the street right now, for example, to a kid that is running around and playing. Non attraversare la strada, don't cross the street. It can be useful, and extremely useful because sometimes you will be fined if you're in Italy if you do something that you're not allowed to do. So, for example, if you eat in a place where you're not allowed to eat and it's written non mangiare, and usually we'll also find the English version, but not always. If you do it, you get fined. So maybe I'm sending you a fine here. Alright, welcome to the class about I pronomi doppi, double pronouns. So this is a topic that I believe is one of the most misunderstood topics. We use them a lot in Italian, and it looks very hard and tricky because it's a three-dimensional topic, but it's not really as hard as it looks. È più facile di quello che sembra. So how do pronomi doppi, double pronouns, work? At a very simple level, sometimes we have two different pronouns. We have an example here. If we have a sentence such as, I tell this to you, io dico questo a te, this would be the long form, we can compact it, as we know, using pronouns, but we can do it two different ways. We can say, io ti dico questo, or even io te lo dico. So that te would be the indirect object, to you, and lo would be the direct object, that or this. So as you can see, it looks a little bit tricky, it looks a little bit confusing, because in English you don't really care too much about that, but in Italian we do. And we do that in different ways, different dimensions that we have to worry about. But once you understand the way we do this, it's very, very simple. It's always the same. There's really no science to it besides understanding what's going on. So first and foremost, we see that we have the indirect object first. When we have two pronouns, we have the indirect pronoun first. Te lo dico. You cannot say io lo te dico. You have to say io te lo dico. That's a good idea to kind of keep one in mind. So keep in mind the sentence io te lo dico. And it's kind of a very good blueprint because everything works the same way as this one. And we can quickly look at a few examples with the verb dire. Now, for example, I could tell you or anybody else. So io me lo dico, I tell this to myself. Io te lo dico, I tell this to you. Io glielo dico, I tell this to him or to her. That glielo is same in both situations. Io ce lo dico, I tell this to us. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but grammatically works. Io ve lo dico, I tell this to you all. And io lo dico a loro. And as we know, for loro, we talked about this in the previous course, but if you don't know, some people will say io glielo dico for a loro. I don't like that. Grammatically, that's not really correct Italian, so I don't use that. I just say io lo dico a loro. In this case, as you see, we do not combine the two pronouns. So the only tricky one really here is glielo, because it becomes one word. But it's basically tricky only if you have to write it, because otherwise, if you didn't put them together, which you have to, you would say glielo dico. It's understood. It's a mistake. Glielo is the only correct form, but if you say glielo, I will understand what you're saying. You can, however, also go down the other way. For example, io me lo dico, I tell this to myself. Tu me lo dici, you tell this to me. Lui o lei me lo dice, he or she tells this to me. Noi me lo diciamo, we tell this to me. Makes no sense again, but grammatically works. Voi me lo dite, you all tell this to me. Loro me lo dicono, they tell this to me. And we can even use this with different direct pronouns. For example, io me lo dico, I tell this masculine to me. Io me la dico, I tell this feminine to myself. Io me li dico, I tell this plural masculine to myself. Io me le dico, feminine plural. Io me ne dico, in this case we don't really use ne with dire, we could say with parlare. Io me ne parlo, I talk about this to myself, which makes no sense really, but it works again grammatically. So the problem with double pronouns is that they can really go down three different ways. Because we can change subject, io, tu, and so forth. We can change the direct object, lo, la, li, le, ne, or even ci, which is not in here because it's not very common in this context, so I didn't want to complicate it. Or we can change the indirect object, so me, te, gli, ce, ve, and a loro. And I put together one of the tables, and basically it only includes lo as a direct object. So you can just replace lo with la, li, le, ne to have all the other examples. And keep in mind that we can do this with basically any other verb, although not all verbs will have both direct and indirect object at the same time. Some verbs can't. For example, andare. You cannot have a direct object for andare. You don't say io lo vado. You cannot say that. And it's very common, but that's beyond the point. Whenever you want to mesh two pronouns together, keep in mind a few examples. So again, I told you, io te lo dico. That's a very good example to keep in mind because that's very common. Keep in mind a few more. For example, tu me lo dici. You tell this to me. Tu me ne parli. You speak about this with me. This is important for you to understand. You do not need to be able to say this. You need to understand when people say this. So I will put a few examples and a few exercises where I say things in Italian and you have to understand the English translation. This is more important at this stage. And then if you do want to actually use this in your active vocabulary, then you can practice a lot more. But for now, just make sure you understand when people are using this. Okay, we're here. This is one of the most dreaded topics in Italian. Il congiuntivo, the subjunctive. Why is it? I don't know. We just don't understand it. It's pretty cool. But in general, the reason is that we don't have it in English, or we do have it, but it doesn't really matter too much. And it's very important in Italian and basically all other languages derived from Latin. And each of these languages uses it slightly differently as well. So the subjunctive in Italian is not exactly the same as the subjunctive in English, in Spanish, which makes it harder. But obviously if you speak Spanish, it's going to be a whole lot easier to make the transition. So, in generale, il congiuntivo esprime incertezza. In general, the general rule why we see the subjunctive, you always have to remember the default way to speak in Italian is the indicative, what we've seen so far. Presente, imperfetto, passato prossimo, futuro. This is the normal way to speak. If you're speaking differently, there is a meaning, there is a reason why. If you use the subjunctive, you're expressing uncertainty, subjectiveness, hypothesis, something that is not a fact, something that is not, in your opinion, objective. So again, something being objective is subjective as well. It's complicated, but generally speaking, you're adding some sort of doubt to what you're saying or to what someone else is saying. The subjunctive is a mode and it has 4 tenses. We'll see 2 in a second and 2 in a little bit. But the tenses, you can trust me or not, are very simple. The conjugations are very simple. The problem with the subjunctive is when you use it. And the point is, if you go and try and Google when to use the subjunctive in Italian, you will find a list of a billion trillion ways and times in which you want to use it. That's not, in my opinion, helpful. So I'm going to start slowly giving you the most obvious places to find the subjunctive. We'll see one of them, which is the if clause. We'll see the second and third type if clause use the subjunctive, imperfetto e trapassato, respectively, and a few other situations, and then you can go and add. In general, the subjunctive in a sentence will come after che. This is not an ironclad rule, it can be broken, but if you're speaking and you're saying che, and you're connecting 2 different sentences, it is possible that you're expected to use subjunctive after, unless what you're saying is an absolute fact. Let's see a couple of examples here, but in general, don't be scared of this topic. So let's see 2 sentences side by side and understand why one uses the subjunctive and one doesn't. Let's say that I want to say, I know that you're right, fact, or I think that you're right, not fact. So in English, you wouldn't really care. You could say something like, I think you be right. Maybe you would say that like 150 years ago. Maybe you would highlight it somewhere. We'll see that English, we still have some subjunctive. If I were you, that's a subjunctive. But it doesn't matter in English. Like if you don't say it, nobody's gonna care. People don't use it much anymore. In Italian we do. For now, although I think in 20, 30 years it's gonna die because it's just not useful anymore. But beyond the point. So if I want to say I know that you're right, I will say io so che tu hai ragione, indicative. I'm stating what to me is a fact. I know that you're right. If I want to say I think that you're right, penso che tu abbia ragione. So che tu hai ragione, penso che tu abbia ragione. Let's not worry about that abbia. We'll see the conjugation literally in 5 minutes, but the difference is in the first case, I know you're right, indicative, fact. In the second case, I want to add that layer of uncertainty or subjectiveness. In that case, I think that you're right, which means that someone else doesn't. It's kind of, you see what I'm saying? There is something else. It's like the sentence does not end there. If I say, io so che tu hai ragione, I know that you're right, that can be it. If I say, I think that you're right, there is a but. There's always some except, but someone else doesn't, or this is the problem, or you have to prove it, or there is a but. And let's see a few more examples of this. Se io fossi italiano, studierei inglese. If I were Italian, I would study English. We'll see that, this is an if clause, we'll see that in a second. Spero che tu vinca. I hope that you win. There is that subjectiveness. I'm not saying spero che tu vinci. Vinca is the subjunctive here. I'm saying spero che tu vinca. So, in general, the first, tip that there might be a subjunctive, if you use the verb penso, credo, spero, immagino. So, I think, I believe, I hope, I imagine. Tutti i verbi che esprimono incertezza o soggettività. Any verb expressing uncertainty or subjectivity. I think. It's not a fact. I think. So, whenever I'm expressing that uncertainty, usually want to use a subjunctive. This is the easiest time. If you use the verb penso, use the subjunctive after. We'll see in a second what the subjunctive actually looks like, but remember this. Penso, credo, spero. These 3 verbs, subjunctive. Let's get started with some of the conjugations of the subjunctive, the congiuntivo. And we'll now see two tenses, presente and imperfetto. So subjunctive has 4 different tenses. We'll see 2 more later. But I know it's overwhelming, so I recommend take it, slowly, bit by bit. Do not overwhelm yourself trying to learn everything since you don't quite know how to use it yet. So start with this, congiuntivo presente, which is the same as the indicativo presente, just we use it as said in specific situations, which again will take you quite some time to figure out. The conjugations are fairly simple, but again, it's a lot of different things, it's a lot of tenses. So if you feel like you're struggling, you're not learning, you can do it bit by bit, do other stuff, progress with the course, practice what you've done so far, and don't just try to do as much as you can of this specific topic if you see it's not working out for you. So let's get started with, I have a few verbs here on screen, but we can start with just the simplest one, amare. So first conjugation, regular verb. I'm gonna read it all first, and then we see what's weird about this. Che io ami, che tu ami, che lui o che lei ami, che noi amiamo, che voi amiate, che loro amino. Here too, amino, not amino, amino. So we see a few things immediately. Number one, we see that we usually, when we talk about the subjunctive and we practice it, we put the che in front of it just to recognize that it's a subjunctive. Usually that happens also in regular conversation, although it's possible to find subjunctives that are not preceded by che. So it's not a strict rule when you speak, when you read, or when you write. But when you study, it's a good rule to put che, so just you don't get confused. Secondly, we see that the first, second, and third person are all the same. And this happens for basically any verb in any conjugation ever in the subjunctive present. And we will see that something similar happens in the other tenses of the subjunctive as well. Which means that we cannot, usually when using the subjunctive, we cannot skip the io, tu, lui, lei, noi, voi, loro, the subject pronoun, because it would be unclear. If I just say che ami, not clear who I'm talking about, if myself, you, or someone else that is not here. So usually we do want to include, when we speak, also the subject. And finally, we see, just looking at this verb, a couple of more interesting things. The noi looks very similar to the present tense, noi amiamo, and that's because it's the same. It's the same exact word. So whenever you have noi and it's a present, you do not need to worry whether you want to use the subjunctive or not, because they're the same when it comes to the present. So that's a little trick for you. If you're unsure whether in a sentence you want to use the subjunctive or not, make it so you're speaking as we, and just say the normal verb and it's going to be fine either way. Not always possible, but sometimes you can. Instead of talking about yourself, talk about us, and you can do that. And then we see a couple more things. We see that voi is similar, but it used to be amate, now it's amiate. So it's similar to the present, but slightly different in this case. And something that I can tell you immediately, and we can look at the verb essere straight away, is that even though often subjunctive is tricky and it can be quite irregular, it tends to be irregular in a way that is very regular, very coherent. So very similarly to, for example, the future or the conditional, if you know io, you know the whole thing, even if it's irregular, because even if it's irregular, the ending will be the same. Differently from, for example, the present tense, in which, for example, if I tell you conjugate the verb andare, you have no idea, it changes, in this case it's not. So the conjugations in the subjunctive are fairly simple. What is harder is when to use the subjunctive. So let's look at the verb essere. As we know, essere usually the verb that is the most annoying of all. And we see che io sia, che tu sia, che lui sia, che noi siamo, che voi siate, che loro siano. So it's the same. And if you look at, for example, leggere, which is second conjugation, and essere, which is second conjugation, and avere, which is second conjugation, you will see that they're all the same. They're all the same. There is no difference. The first, second, and third person end in a. Then we have iamo, iate, ano. That's it. And the third conjugation is basically behaving exactly like the second conjugation. The first conjugation is slightly different. So a good way to practice is practice amare and then leggere, then practice cantare, and then any other verb of the second conjugation. Regular or not, it doesn't matter. But try to look side by side to amare and then to leggere / dormire, and you're going to be fine. As you see on the screen, it's very simple. And we also see that for verbi incoativi, we have finire, it just behaves basically the same way as the indicative. So finisca, 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 goes back to finiamo, finiate, goes back to finiscano. So no difference, exactly like for the present, we have io, tu, lui, lei, and loro, having this ISC form, and then everything else, noi and voi, not having this ISC form. Again, start practicing, and then slowly, don't get frustrated if you feel like you're not really improving. This is something you're building for the future, and in the case of the subjunctive, you want to know a little bit about it, because if people use it, you need to know that they're using it. Even if you decide not to use it and just to speak broken Italian, imperfect Italian, just never using the subjunctive, which is a decision that you can make, it's your decision. It's important that you understand when a subjunctive is being used, who the person is referring to. Possiamo ora guardare il congiuntivo imperfetto, che è il passato semplice. So we can now look at the imperfect subjunctive, which is one of the simple pasts and the only simple past of the subjunctive. Simple past being a past where there is only one word, as in this case, amassi, as opposed to, for example, what we will see, the trapassato, avessi amato, 2 words, 2 verbs. So composite versus simple tenses. I think we talked about this quickly before. E il congiuntivo imperfetto è ancora più facile del congiuntivo presente. This is even simpler than the present subjunctive, because I've put 6 verbs on the screen, if I'm counting right, which are first, second, third conjugation regular, essere, avere, finire, verbo incoattivo. And if you look at all of them, you will see that they're exactly the same. You know one, you know all. There is basically no conjugation you need to worry about. The endings are always the same. So as long as you identify correctly the root of the verb, you're fine. And as you will see, we will look at the verb essere, and very similarly to the subjunctive present, it can be irregular, but it's, as in the subjunctive present, going to be irregular in a very coherent way. So just like for the subjunctive present, it was sia, the root, and it stayed like that. Here it's fossi, and it stays like that. So let's look at just one verb randomly. It can be amare, because it's the first one that I see. Che io amassi, che tu amassi, che lui o che lei amasse, che noi amassimo, che voi amaste, che loro amassero. And you will see that basically what you do is you take the infinitive, take away re, and then add the desinence, the ending. So how do you recognize when you hear someone speaking an imperfect subjunctive? A lot of S's. If there are 2 S's in a row, you can be basically certain it's congiuntivo imperfetto or trapassato, which is, we'll see in a while probably. But anyways, if you hear this S, as you see, all the verbs have this S. If you hear it, it's a subjunctive imperfetto. And let's look at the verb essere. And you, I think, will understand now why I want you to have a look at this at the very least, even if you decide not to learn and use them actively at this point in your learning experience. Che io fossi, che tu fossi, che lui o che lei fosse, che noi fossimo, che voi foste, che loro fossero. Fossero. As you see, irregular, but it works and behaves exactly just like the verb amare. You can literally compare them. It's one on top of the other, so you can just easily look and you will see it's the same exact thing. SSI, SSI, SSE, and so forth. No difference, the same exact thing, which is a rare occurrence in Italian. But you will see that if I didn't tell you that this was the verb essere, you would think this was the verb, I don't know, fore, fere, something, right? Because it doesn't even look anymore like the verb essere. So if someone tells you fossi, just as a word, and you kind of need to know what it means because it's a verb essere, which is it's gonna happen often that they use this word. So again, even if you decide not to study them at this stage, which you're free to do, know that this is this. Know that this is essere, know what avere is, and maybe look at some of the most important verbs that you know you use most often. It could be your potere, dovere, volere. It could be your andare. It could be your verbs that you notice, fare, dire, dare. Verbs that you know that you use often and that sometimes can be a little bit tricky. But again, if you know the io, you know the whole thing. So practice with the io and you're gonna be fine. Emozioni. Eccoci a alcune parole che ci permettono di dire come ci sentiamo. So on this slide we have some nouns and some adjectives of what I believe are the most commonly used words for emotions in Italian. Abbiamo la parola inglese, per esempio angry, e il nome e l'aggettivo corrispondenti in italiano, rabbia, il nome, arrabbiato, l'aggettivo, e un esempio. Io sono arrabbiato. I am angry. So, let's see a few more. Scared. It would be something like spavento, a scare. Spaventato would be the adjective. Sono spaventato, sono spaventata would be the way we use it, the example of the adjective. So we see that all these adjectives we use with the verb essere, quindi io sono, tu sei, lui è, and so forth. And we could argue that this arrabbiato looks a lot like a past participle, which is not quite, although it works the same way. So for example, io sono arrabbiato means I am angry, not I was angry. It's not io sono stato, which is I was, or io sono andato, which is I've gone. It's a present tense. I am angry. I am scared, for example. Annoyed, il fastidio, e infastidito. Sono infastidito. And I kind of would like you to look at a few quirks of this. So you will see that sometimes before the noun we add something, which is common. Often adjectives work this way in Italian. For example, we don't say fastidito, we say infastidito. We don't say arrabbiato, we say arrabbiato. Sometimes we add this at the beginning and it's good to remember what we add for a specific word. There is not really a rule. It's kind of the way it works in each situation. So you kind of have to remember, but it's not too hard either. Surprised, la sorpresa, surprise, e sorpreso o sorpresa. Obviously, if you were to do the plural, it would be noi siamo sorpresi or noi siamo sorprese. It works like any other adjective. Confused, la confusione, confuso. Happy, felicità o contentezza, sono felice o sono contento. They're about the same. In Italian, there's not really a big difference. Felice is bigger, so it's more like happy, whereas contento is more like, it's not really content, it's still happy, but it's less happy than felice. Sad, la tristezza, and triste. Disappointed, la delusione, e deluso.
hate, l'odio. And we don't really have a way to say hateful, because if you say odioso, it means more like hated. So you would say something like full of hatred, or pieno di odio, for example. Or you would resort to another adjective. For example, arrabbiato is not quite the same, but it kind of works the same way. Hopeful, la speranza, the hope. Speranzoso, the adjective. Love, obviously amore, we know that. Innamorato. Keep in mind that amore, just like fastidio, adds in. Innamorato, infastidito. Curious, la curiosità. Curioso. Sad, la tristezza. Triste. Embarrassed, l'imbarazzo. Imbarazzato. So if you're a Spanish speaker, there is a very similar word in Spanish that means pregnant, not in Italian. In Italian, imbarazzo just means, again, embarrassment. Proud, l'orgoglio, orgoglioso. So similar to curioso in this case. And then grateful, la gratitudine, grato. Vediamo adesso alcuni connettori testuali. So what is this? This is kind of just connectors. So we'll make a few examples, but in English you can think and, or, while. These kind of words that basically allow you to connect two different sentences. So these are, in my opinion, very useful because it's hard to remember all of them. And if you use the wrong one, the sentence will kind of be different. And you have a lot of categories here. You have 7 categories, but obviously you do not need to remember them, but it's kind of to help you to learn them in, the right way. So basically these categories that you see, congiuntivi, disgiuntivi, and so forth, kind of group them by what they do in the sentence. So do they kind of put two sentences together, like and? Do they make two sentences be kind of one of the opposite, one the opposite of the other, or not, the same thing, just like or in English? Is it about time, and so forth? So let's look at them. Again, don't worry too much about the categories, but it's kind of for you to have them neat and organized on the page. E, obviously we know and, but we could also say something like anche, which is also or too. Inoltre, which is furthermore, moreover. If we want to say neither hot nor cold, for example, we would say né caldo né freddo. And we see that little accent because we already saw the word né, which is a pronoun. Kind of to write it differently, we use that accent on the E. Neanche, nemmeno, e neppure are kind of the same, and that means not even. Then we have those that kind of put two sentences against each other. Or in English, we could say o and oppure in Italian. O is obviously more used. You definitely have seen this already, but it's good to know that oppure means the same thing. We have those that refer to time. And again, we've seen quando, when. We may have seen mentre, while. And we probably didn't see finché, until. So for example, I will try until I succeed. Proverò finché riesco. Something like that. We have those that refer to reason, to causation, such as perché, which is why and because, as we know. Dato che and visto che would mean since, not since as in time, but since as in because. So since it's too early, ... Dato che o visto che è troppo presto, ... We have those that are a consequence. So for example, perciò. So all of these mean for this reason, basically. Perciò, quindi, dunque, per questo motivo. You can use whichever, but I would argue that quindi and dunque are the most common. And we recommend you don't use perciò because it can be very similar to perché in some uses, not in others. So it's more confusing. I would say quindi and dunque are the most commonly used. Then we have those that kind of talk about an end. So finali, fine, would be end. So in English it would be kind of like so that, or to that end, sort of thing. So affinché, perché, al fine di, o per. Per in italiano può essere molte cose. It also means so that. For example, ti chiamo per parlare. I call you so that we speak. And finally, those that talk about how we do things, which is kind of the catch-all, category. And we have a few of them. Comunque, which is anyways. Nel senso che, which is sort of like I mean, or in the sense that. In qualunque modo, in any way. And there is a billion more in this specific category, which is, in my opinion, the least interesting, the least important. But do remember comunque because we use it a lot. Now I want to talk a little bit about sì in Italian. Not sì as in yes, but sì is kind of a weird word that we use in two different ways. It's not very used in other languages the same way that we do. There's something similar in French, we'll see. But in English, not really. That sì can be used in two different ways. It's called passivante, which basically makes a sentence, an active sentence into a passive sentence. We'll see examples. And impersonale, so a sì that is kind of a general subject that is not really, used explicitly, but is there. The sì passivante basically is used to turn a verb into a passive. And this is especially used, in my opinion, in some areas of Italy. For example, in Tuscany, I believe they use that a lot. But in general, it's understood everywhere. And you could see this, you could hear this, and it's kind of important that you understand how to use it. If you speak French, this is very similar like the French on, and it's kind of used the same way. So basically what we do is, let's say that we have a sentence with like tutti hanno sentito un rumore. Everybody heard a noise. Which is a very straightforward, simple sentence. How do we make this different? We could say something like si è sentito un rumore. A noise was heard. Which in English you probably wouldn't really care to say that way. In English in general is a good rule to avoid passive voices as much as you can. So for example, if you write like a blog, for example, and you have some search engine optimization tool on, it will tell you use too many passive voices. In English, the passive voice is not really that used. I would say in Italian we use it more and it's less bad than in English in general. So this is fine. This is fine to use and it's very common. Why would you say si è sentito un rumore as opposed to tutti hanno sentito un rumore? It's kind of the same thing. It's probably 50-50, which a person would use. But again, basically, in the second case, si è sentito un rumore, the focus is more on the noise. Whereas in the first case, tutti hanno sentito un rumore, the focus is more on everybody. So, it's not really that big of a difference, but it's kind of giving a slightly different meaning to the sentence, where the core of the sentence is the noise and not anymore everybody. So we could use this in many different ways. A few examples here. Sentiamo dei rumori, si sentono dei rumori, o dei rumori si sentono. Sentiamo la musica, si sente la musica. And so you'll see that if it's plural, as in si sentono dei rumori, plural, rumori, then it becomes si sentono. If it's singular, such as la musica, si sente, singular. That makes sense. And it's very important that we cannot use this when the subject is clearly defined. So if you have a sentence like un uomo mi ha chiamato, a man called me, you cannot use that si in any ways. There's no way you can use that si. In that case, you just need to do a normal passive. And then we have another type of si, which is, it looks the very same, but it's slightly different. In this case, si is the subject of the sentence. The subject must be we, they, or nobody. So for example, if you want to say, che cosa facciamo? You may want to say this as che si fa. Same thing. Impossible to translate in English. I have no idea how to render this sentence che si fa in English. Something like, what does one do? If you, it means something different, but it's kind of the similar idea. But again, in English, that doesn't really exist. The si doesn't exist. You make passive a different way, so it doesn't work. Or if you want to say come traduco questa parola, you could say something like come si traduce? How is this translated? Again, try to use this a little bit, both cases, try to practice them, and be ready whenever you hear that si in a sentence, be ready that it might be, and it probably is, one of these two uses. Abbiamo già visto il condizionale presente, un esempio vorrei, potrei, saprei, and so forth. E sappiamo che il condizionale presente traduce would, so vorrei, I would like, I would want. Il condizionale passato is the exact same thing, but that does that in the past. So instead of I would want today, I would have wanted yesterday or last year. And this is important, not only because we use it, just as a standalone, like yesterday, I would have liked to do something. We also use this in the third type of if clause, the one we have not seen yet, because we need some more subjunctive, but coming up soon. You will find that this is very, very helpful in a few specific sentences that you will want to put together. Now, when we start talking about this tense, which is fairly straightforward and simple, very straightforward and simple as a matter of fact, this is not really a problem to learn. The problem with this tense is that when you see it, it's hard to unsee it, and you are going to get kind of stuck using harder sentences. And we'll talk about the way tenses follow each other in Italian later on. Italian is very strict when it comes to the use of tenses. And this tense is specifically necessary when we want to create a few specific structures. So you will find yourself trying to make sentences that are fairly hard, just in meaning, and that would not be that hard in English. And you understand why Italian verbs are a bit harder than English verbs, because you need to be very specific which tense you use in specific examples. Again, it's hard for me to explain you right now because unclear what I mean, but you will see very soon when we talk about, for example, the if clause, the third type, you will understand what I mean when you have to choose your tense carefully. So we have here our standard 5 verbs: cantare, leggere, dormire, avere, essere, first, second, third conjugation, and then avere and essere. But no need to remember any of that. The way we do it is very simple. Subject plus auxiliary verb, essere or avere, in the conditional present, simple conditional, and then the past participle of the verb that we use. So for example, if we go back to the present conditional, cantare would be I would sing, would be io canterei. Here it's io avrei cantato. So we conjugate avrei, avere, and we leave cantato the same. So if you look at cantare, io avrei cantato, tu avresti cantato, lui avrebbe cantato, noi avremmo cantato, voi avreste cantato, loro avrebbero cantato. And in general, in Italian, always when you have a verb that is a mode that is composite, a tense that is composite, it's simpler because you just need to remember 2 verbs, avere and essere, and then you usually just use the past participle. That's the way we do it in Italian. So easier. And obviously, if you wanted to use this with andare, io sarei andato o andata, tu saresti andato o andata, lui sarebbe andato o andata, noi saremmo andati o andate, voi sareste andati, andate, loro sarebbero andati, andate. Also remember that in this case as well, if we use essere as an auxiliary for a verb that does not need essere as an auxiliary, it's kind of a passive. It becomes passive. For example, if you say io avrei letto, you're saying I would have read. If you say io sarei letto, you're saying I would be read. So first of all, it's a present tense. Io sarei letto is present right now. Second, it's a passive. So you're not reading anymore, you're being read, which in English as in Italian might mean someone understands you, someone reads you, like in poker, for example. But it means something quite different. So be careful using the right auxiliary. This is the only thing you need to worry with composite tenses. Use the right auxiliary. And so if you don't remember when we use avere, when we use essere, go look it up again. Again, quickly, we use avere for most verbs. So if you're unsure, usually it's avere. We use essere for verbs that usually talk about moving, evolution, or change. So andare, salire, scendere, cambiare, evolvere. Let's talk about intercalari or fillers. What is a filler in English? A filler is a word like or so or all these words, that are in between, words and don't mean anything. Usually we're thinking, we're not sure what to say, or it's just a bad habit that we have. In any language, fillers are usually considered something you shouldn't say. When you learn a language, start speaking a few words and you start saying like in English, your teacher would tell you not to say like, because even though people say it in real life, it's literally useless. Like you do not need to say like to explain yourself, right? It's just don't say it. Or so, don't start a sentence with so. That's one of the first things you learn when you study English. E anche in italiano esistono gli intercalari. Kind of a very complex word to say, filler. E sono parole che significano qualcosa, ma non in quel contesto. These are all words that mean something, but not in that context. In that context, if you hear one of these words, completely skip it. So if you're speaking with an Italian and they know you're not a native speaker, they will usually try to kind of strip out their language of everything that is just not important, because it's kind of a harder thing to follow someone speaking that drops words that are useless and you need to avoid. It's one of the hardest things when you're trying to speak a language to understand if the person uses sentences that they do not need to use, because you're kind of trying to understand each and every word. You're using brain power just for nothing word. So it's really important to know that these words might or might not be fillers. Also very important, these words kind of change depending on where you are. So in different cities, in different regions, we will use different fillers, as in English, I'd argue, and any other language. But these are kind of the most commonly used words. I'll tell you what they mean, but again, very often they don't mean anything, because they're just used as fillers. They're just used because we don't know what to say in that specific moment. Allora, most common of all, in my opinion. Allora is used just like so at the beginning of the sentence. Also means so. Therefore. Appunto means right. Insomma, overall, or also in some cases used as so. Like if you ask come stai, and the answer insomma is like, no, it could be better. Diciamo, again, very common. Let's say, something like that. Or we can say. Voglio dire, I mean, or I want to say. Again, often means nothing, sometimes it means something. And I would argue the most common of all, especially in the north, cioè, which means that is, I mean, And it's used so often that a lot of people would actually not even say the whole word and just say something like c'è, or just kind of take the O out. So if someone keeps saying like cioè or c'è, just don't learn to skip that word because it means nothing. So again, please don't use these words, but please recognize them because again, they might throw you kind of out of bounds. Time to look at passato remoto, which is the Italian kind of the same as the simple past in English. So, for example, saying I went as opposed to I have gone. So the name in Italian is not really a good name because it's not a simple past. The Italian name remoto means something like remote, and ideally the idea of the passato remoto and the way in which it should be used, theory at least, is to talk about events that are further away in the past. So whereas you shouldn't say yesterday I went, but you should say yesterday I have gone using the passato prossimo. If you're talking about like 1 year ago, you may want to use the passato remoto. Now this is in theory, because in practice, in the north of Italy, and I would say from Rome north, the only area that uses the passato remoto somewhat is Tuscany. And then it's very used, south of Rome. So it's kind of a line that we have there. And the point is, in Milan, we never use it. In Rome, they never use it, basically. In all the north, we never use it. In most of the central Italy, never used. If you go to Naples, it's always used. So in Milan, we would say, last year I have gone, whereas in Naples, they would say, 1 hour ago I went. So that definition that I was giving you doesn't really make sense in modern Italian. That's kind of something of the past. And I told you when way back when talking about the passato prossimo, I told you that there is the passato remoto, which you shouldn't learn. So why is it here? Well, first of all, you shouldn't learn it necessarily because it's hard. It's actually one of the most complex tenses that we have. Basically, every verb behaves irregularly, and it's very hard to know how to conjugate it properly. So that's why it's harder to learn. So why is it here? Well, the point is, right now your Italian is getting better, and it's getting to the point where you can sort of start thinking about maybe reading news articles or reading a book. And il passato remoto in italiano è un passato più elegante, più formale. We see this as somewhat more elegant and more formal tense. So if you read literature, even today's books, we use the passato remoto 9 times out of 10. And if you read more complex like essays and all that, like whatever situation in which you want to be more elegant and more formal, people will use this. So it's useful to know if you want to read. It's useful to understand it. I would not recommend you try and learn it because everybody will understand you, even in the South, if you use the passato prossimo, which is a lot easier. So if you want to add the passato remoto to your vocabulary and to your grammar, like active use, it's something for later. So ci sono alcuni verbi, amare, leggere, dormire, essere, avere, e poi alcuni esempi, some examples of other verbs. The somewhat good thing of the passato remoto is that it's kind of consistent in the endings, but you will see that basically verbs are irregular always. So the first part of the verb will change. I will see examples here. Verbs that are regular, like leggere, become completely insane. And verbs that are always irregular, like essere, it's worse. So let's look at amare, which is somewhat okay. Io amai, tu amasti, lui amò, noi amammo, voi amaste, loro amarono. And we can see here a few things. This io will often end with I or I in Italian. It's fairly common. You will see that basically all the verbs here end in I, in the io form. Then we have this sti for you, tu sti. And then the third conjugation, the third person, sorry, lui, lei, changes a bit. So we have o with an accent here for amare. We have I, we have I. And as you see, different conjugations behave differently. So let's take three verbs of the third conjugation, leggere, essere, e avere. The third person is lesse for leggere, fu for essere, and ebbe for avere. So you would argue that the ending should be I for the third conjugation, and it's O with accent for the first conjugation. It's I with an accent for the third conjugation. But as you see, there is already, something weird about this ending. Then the noi is often ending with MMO, SDE for voi, rono, or better, arono, or irono for loro. So you can see that, for example, as I was telling you, the verb leggere starts to behave already in a weird way. Leggere is usually one of the verbs that we take for regular, but in this case it's not. It kind of goes back and forth between these GG, leg, like the standard form, and this double S, less. So kind of the two, between it goes back and forth. Io, lui, lei, and loro are double S. Tu, noi, and voi are double G. And then we have the verb essere, obviously one of the first verbs you should learn. Io fui, tu fosti, lui fu, noi fummo, voi foste, loro furono. This is again really weird looking, but if you already looked at the congiuntivo imperfetto of the verb essere, you may remember fossi, che io fossi, for example. So it's kind of the same, way. And again, this comes from Latin, and it looks different because Latin and whatnot. And then avere in this case also looking pretty weird. Io ebbi and so forth. In this case, going back and forth between this ABB form and the standard av form. I have here a list that I've printed out for myself. You have a few more verbs, and again, this is kind of to tell you how they work, and kind of, I really think what you should do here is try to get to the point where you can understand what a verb is in its passato remoto form, rather than actively being able to use it. If you want to be able to use it, if you speak Spanish, you're mostly going to be fine, because it works very similar to Spanish, and many verbs are very similar to Spanish. If you don't speak Spanish or French or, any of these other languages similar to Italian, active use of this tense will not be something that comes easy to you. So here we have a few examples. First conjugation works pretty well. We can see that the ending is often I. So parlai, mangiai, pagai, ascoltai, incontrai, amai. And we have the second conjugation, where io often ends in I again, but without the A. So presi, vidi, vinsi, vissi, conobbi, chiesi, e misi. The second conjugation, as we know, is always the tricky one in Italian, and this is a confirmation of that, because of these verbs I cannot see any regular one. So maybe chiesi and presi are somewhat okay, but everything else changes the root. So like mettere becomes mi, conoscere, the double B, what's that about? Vincere, the C becomes an S, vivere, whatever. So that's what I'm saying. Whereas the third conjugation ends in double I very often, so ii in Italian. Aprì, partì, sentì, offrì, dormì. And then we have a few other important verbs, conjugated the whole thing. We have, for example, fare, which becomes fe or feci, io feci, which, if you're wondering, that's, by the way, the same way we say feces in the plural in Italian. Sorry about that. That's the way it works. Dire, double S comes out sometimes. So basically, the whole point of this class is do not worry too much about this tense. if you speak Spanish, I would say Spanish is the closest that I know. Maybe try and like look, back to back to the two languages, because in Spanish they use this tense a lot, more than the other past. But in Italian we don't, so don't really burden yourself with actively using this. But if you see something like, for example, io feci, which as I was telling you also means something else, you should know that it means to make or to do, because otherwise it's going to be very confused. So try to get to the point where you can understand roughly what the verb means, and that's, in my opinion, enough.